was the work of some consciousness, was the work of a creator, and if not, what are the alternative explanations? So those are I mean, these are some of the most important themes in the history of religious thinking and the history of philosophical thinking, and of course in the modern field of cosmology, which seeks to explain these questions scientifically. So it's just bound to be an incredibly stimulating and remarkable discussion. And I know that the organizers have set plenty of time aside for discussion, and you'll have lots of meals together, and I just imagine it'll be a truly electrifying experience for all of you who are here. I would like you to submit your written answers to all these questions at the end. There are many people out there curious to what the real answers are. And why is it I'm betting that there's not a complete consensus at the end of this conference on the answer to all these questions? You know, the thrill of it and the excitement and the learning from it will come from the posing of the questions, from the articulation of positions, and hopefully from the glimmers, the little bits of differential movement that people will find in their own positions by confronting their initial ideas with creative ideas from other fields and other disciplines. These are, of course, the great imponderable questions. Well, not imponderable, they're the great unanswerable questions, but they are ponderable questions. That's the whole point of this, is to think about questions that are not easy to answer and that nonetheless have an extraordinary significance in our lives. A university is, of course, the place to do this. A great center of liberal learning like Yale is, I think, an ideal setting for this kind of dialogue. We have great strength in all the disciplines represented by the three leaders of this conference, and we have, we've always tried in our 310 years of existence to be a place that fosters open communication, free thinking, free and open discussion of provocative and challenging ideas. It's something that's in our blood, and it's of course at the heart of the liberal education that we offer to our students is the sort of imperative to question everything, to not take anything for granted, to think deeply about subjects and to really ask the very hardest questions and learn through pursuing the answers, even if not arriving at the destination. So I congratulate you on posing such a bold and ambitious challenge. I thank all of you who've come from afar to participate in this intellectual adventure, and I do look forward to hearing from my colleagues at the end of the conference about what all has been learned and what the experience has been like. I truly do wish I could spend a little time listening to all of you, but such is the burdens of my job that I'm off to give an interview for Chinese television. So I will. It's great to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy.
I believe I'm chairing this session, which, as a matter of fact, is a sort of an attempt by the three of us to give some sort of account of how come this conference. Why anything, yes, is what it's about. Why this is, well, I think what, in our different ways, we now wish to explain. And then I think we're likely to each of us be rather briefer than the program has scheduled us to be, which has the advantage of, well, one way or another, whichever you regard as the greater advantage, the opportunity for more open discussion, or the opportunity just to sort of close this session a little bit early and provide some of that space, which I think enough conferences don't give enough to, and that is the opportunity for informal discussion around a cup of coffee or whatever. But in any case, I think just to set the ball rolling, we thought that each of the three of us would give, from our different perspectives, some sort of idea of why it was that we thought that doing this would be a good thing to do. And so I'll ask Priya if you want to set up.
Sit here, or should I go there? Should I sit here and read
Sit
it?
there, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, unless you want to.
No, I think this is probably better. Okay, thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you to all of you for being here. So the idea for this conference really came out of a conversation and debate over coffee that Dennis Turner and I had a couple of years ago when we first met at yet another failed science-religion dialogue talk. Dissatisfied with the discourse and even the terms of the discourse, we started talking about how camps that believed in very different kinds of explanations could actually have a conversation. We had an animated discussion about what requires an explanation, of course, and what kinds of explanations do we really have at hand, and whether existing intellectual frameworks actually restrict the range of explanations that can be provided. The question of what constitutes a scientific explanation has a very clear answer. The larger question, however, is whether there are other forms of valid explanation, and what criteria do we need to employ to assess the validity of an explanation. Scientists like me are often apt to refer to simplicity, Occam's razor, or even beauty as criteria to assess the validity of an explanation, and viability, actually, of an explanation, or for picking an explanation amongst many that are epistemologically more or less on par. However, these are arguments that work when we compare different explanations that account for the same set of facts. This is not always the case. At this point, we realized that we wanted a philosopher friend to broaden our takes, and we got Michael Della Rocca to join in these sessions. This is when we realized that part of the problem in bringing together people in different academic disciplines lay in the very formulation of questions. What appears to be an ill-posed question to one camp is a rather profound one for the other. So we set about framing a very big question, a grand one that each discipline could assess and interpret in its own terms, and yet hopefully exchange ideas across boundaries. In our conversations over this past year, we did not arrive at any grand consensus ourselves. We met very often. However, we understand each other's intellectual positions in a much more nuanced way. We thought it would be very interesting to bring together some of the leading minds from our diverse disciplines to clarify the how, what, and why questions that each of us can actually ask and potentially answer about the universe. In our discussions, I would often robustly hold forth, defining the kinds of questions that science can ask and answer, elaborating that the only scientific questions worth asking were the how and what questions, and not really the why questions. When I'm attempting to do sort of these brief introductory remarks, what I plan to do is just describe and circumscribe our view, sort of the cosmologist's view, and hopefully along the way give you a brief overview of our current understanding of the universe, which will clarify my position and my views. So here are some of my positions that are pretty representative, I would say, of those taken by most thoughtful cosmologists. All facts have explanations, even if we are never able to gain access to all of the explanations. Despite our limitations, we can know that reality is intelligible through and through. In the context of reason, how can there actually be truths that cannot be explained at all? The world itself must be self-explanatory. Mathematics clearly provides the model for explanation. In mathematics, we see that facts are so because they necessarily have to be so. We discover what things are in the course of proving them to be that way. The nature of objects emerges within proofs. We only know what we have once we have proved it to be true. And that is how it must be for all of reality. Only proofs, or data, can reveal the world to us. There is the mathematical component of science as well as its empiricism. We have an ideal of a theory of everything, one in which the mathematics alone would determine its truth. String theorists in particular are prone to pursue their work almost entirely as a deductive endeavor, with mathematical concerns prevailing even over empirical concerns. This has, of course, sparked the discussion amongst our community and in the broader intellectual sphere of whether string theory is a science at all. I will leave that question to be addressed later on. Coming back to the question of why is there something rather than nothing, this is not a new question, as most of you here probably know better than I. Particularly in philosophy, Leibniz posed it, Spinoza tried to tackle it in the West, and Adi Shankara grappled with it in the East. However, post-Kant, it fell out of fashion. It's a problematic question. What kind of answer could possibly be satisfying? It is essentially problematic due to the fact that there is no external vantage point from which we can compare the relative likelihood of different modes of existence for the universe. We can only talk about likeliness of one thing or another when we have an ensemble and some sort of measure defined thereon. When it comes to the ways that the universe could or could not exist, we do not have this. The question obviously appears to be impossible to answer, as any fact used to explain why there is something will itself be part of the something that needs to be explained. Part of the problem, of course, is that the attribute existence rather, is already presumed in something. And I'm going to leave Michael to tackle this one. In my opinion, the question is neither ill-formed nor meaningless. It actually demarcates the limit of what we can hope to understand. And that's how I see this question. It turns out that Eastern philosophies have absolutely no problem with the idea of nothingness. And in many ways, it's quite central to their framework and a core concept for a lot of their metaphors. One might ask of this kind of why question, why is this question important now? What is special about this juncture? Einstein's profound insight helped us understand that the geometry, the fate, and the contents of the universe are inextricably linked, intricately linked. Within the last decade or so, our theoretical understanding and observational grasp of the universe and its contents has grown tremendously. We now know that dark matter and dark energy constitute the bulk of the energy density of the universe, and baryons, ordinary atoms, the stuff that we're made of, are in fact a minuscule and insignificant part of the inventory of the universe, only about 4%. We have a much sharper understanding of what initial conditions were required to produce this universe with the properties that we measure it to have. We know the past, present, and future of the universe. The current energy budget is dominated by dark energy, which causes the accelerating expansion of the universe, a fundamental discovery that was made as recently as 1998, and one that was recognized as such with the most recent Nobel Prize in Physics announced a couple of days ago. What do we know incontrovertibly? From empirical data, from the extremely young universe, via the sea of cosmic microwave background radiation, the detailed distribution, the three-dimensional detailed distribution of dark matter and galaxies in the universe, we know that initially we started off from a hot, dense state that cooled upon expansion. And small initial fluctuations in the dark matter distribution got amplified under gravity and led subsequently to the formation of structure that we observe today, including our own galaxy. Recent observations of the brightnesses of type 1a supernovae, whose physics we understand very well, led to this discovery of the accelerating expansion of the universe. This accelerating expansion counteracts gravity and amounts to the existence of a repulsive force. What precisely this force is and how it is generated is unknown at the present time. Similarly, although dark matter dominates the mass budget of our universe, and we have detailed observational support for how it's spatially distributed, we are yet to detect the dark matter particle. The most compelling evidence for dark matter is principally derived from observations of speeds of stars and galaxies and the bending of light in the universe. Unlike the solar system, where the speeds of the outer planets is significantly lower than that of the inner planets around the sun, suggesting that the bulk of the gravitational mass is provided by the sun, in the case of galaxies, the speeds of stars as a function of distance from the center does not decline and in fact stays constant as we move outwards from the center in of a galaxy. This suggests the presence of vast amounts of matter, gravitating matter, well into the outskirts of galaxies beyond where we see gas or stars. So we're at a particular juncture, a sort of golden age for cosmology, given the confluence of ideas, instruments, and observational data, aided, of course, vastly by the rapid progress in technology, computers and CCD imagers. I also feel that we're at the brink of detecting the dark matter particle. Well, I'm an optimist, either directly or indirectly from efforts at either the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Geneva or from the many ongoing underground experiments. At any rate, we're poised to make some pretty exciting discoveries in the very near future, but I think it would be fair to say that given what we know, we need to confront the question of why this universe, with this specific set of initial conditions and values for the physical constants. This is not a question that we as cosmologists can skirt around anymore. The multiverse hypothesis offers one possible explanation, but how scientific is it? Is it testable? How unique is our universe? Quite unique, but not ultimately so, in the sense that there likely exists a parallel one that is identical to ours. I will use the multiverse as an exemplar to discuss epistemology and the question of what is knowable, as it brings us very nicely to the fluid line between levels of understanding. Now that we have a pretty good understanding, bar the minor details, that we really don't know what the dark matter is made of or what the nature of dark energy is, we are confronted with the question of why this particular universe and why the physical constants are measured to have the values that they do. As I said, cosmology has often skirted around these questions, but we are now pushed to consider them and see what explanatory framework might be needed in order to address such questions. The core issue, of course, is whether we are capable of understanding what the laws of nature could tell us if we were indeed capable of assimilating them in their entirety. And that is part and parcel. That, of course, is part and parcel of our current scientific sensibility. So coming back to the idea of the multiverse, the concept of the multiverse, or the meta-universe, is the hypothetical set of multiple possible universes, including the one we inhabit, that as an ensemble contain everything that exists, that can exist. All of space, time, matter, energy, and all physical laws and constants that describe them. There are several specific multiverse hypotheses, and the precise structure, nature, and the relationship of the constituent universes vary. A taxonomy does exist for multiverse hypotheses, as these universes are classified into levels. The level one, I'll briefly touch upon them, I think in a later session. I'm expecting that Professor Carr will probably spend a lot more time describing them in detail. Level one multiverse, for instance, is one that lies beyond our cosmological horizon. And the concept of the multiverse refers not so much to actual alternate universes, but rather to different parts of our universe that are causally disconnected from ours and potentially even governed by a different set of low energy laws, although the core fundamental sort of the deep physical laws are the same as in our universe. In this case, this is referred to as a level one multiverse, if one were to take the taxonomy seriously. We could have an ensemble of local regions that even had a well-defined measure on them. I'm going to first stick to the least controversial corner of multiverses, that of parallel universes. Current observations suggest that space appears to be infinite, in which event, even the most unlikely events must somehow take place somewhere. So there is another universe out there where my doppelganger has finished her talk, and where there's a planet Earth in which inhabitants are living in peace and harmony. That is, everything that is possible becomes real, no matter how improbable it is. Beyond the range of our current telescopes and instrumentation lie those regions of space that are identical to ours. Recent observations of the microwave background and the three-dimensional distribution of galaxies reveals that matter is distributed rather uniformly on the larger scales, and that there are no coherent structures larger than about 10 to the power 24 meters. If this observed pattern continues in space beyond our observable universe, and it's still teeming with galaxies, black holes, stars, and planets. All observers living in a level one parallel universe to ours, the level one multiverse, will experience the same laws of physics as we do, but with different initial conditions. In fact, the existence of the level one multiverse universe just beyond our cosmological horizon is predicted by this theory called chaotic inflation. One of the generic predictions of chaotic inflation is an infinite ergodic universe, which by virtue of being infinite must contain Hubble volumes realizing all possible initial conditions. Therefore, an infinite universe will contain an infinite number of Hubble volumes, all having the same physical laws and physical constants. So this is the level one case, where the only difference is the difference in initial conditions. As for the distribution of matter in these, almost all of them will differ from our own Hubble volume. Since there are infinitely many universes far beyond the cosmological horizon, there will eventually be Hubble volumes with similar and even identical configurations. Max Tegmark estimates that an identical volume to ours should be about 10 to the power 115 meters away from us, a number larger than a Googleplex, I may add. This estimate implies use of the cosmological principle, wherein one assumes that our Hubble volume is neither special nor unique. The extension of the same reasoning there would in fact be an infinite number of Hubble volumes identical to ours in the universe. So let's move on to the level two multiverse. So these would be universes with different physical constants. Universes at this level may be classified as bubble universes. They have physical constants that are different from our universe, and our universe just happens to be one of these bubbles. In chaotic inflation, a variant of the cosmic inflation theory, the multiverse as a whole is stretching and will continue doing so forever. But some regions of space stop stretching and form distinct bubbles like gas pockets in a loaf of rising bread. Such bubbles are embryonic level 1 multiverses. However, different bubbles may experience different spontaneous symmetry breaking, resulting in different properties such as different physical constants. Finally, it is important to briefly outline the level 3 multiverses, universes that follow naturally from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Everett's many worlds interpretation is one of several mainstream interpretations of quantum mechanics. In brief, one aspect of quantum mechanics is that certain observations cannot be predicted absolutely. Instead, there's a range of possible observations, each with a different probability. According to the many worlds theory, each of these possible observations corresponds to a different universe. Suppose a die is thrown that contains 6 sides and that the result corresponds to a quantum mechanics observable. All 6 possible ways the die can fall correspond to 6 different universes. More correctly, in the many worlds interpretation, there's only a single universe, but after the split into many worlds, these cannot in general interact and are akin to different universes. The only difference between the level 1 and level 3 multiverse is where your doppelgangers reside. In level 1, they live elsewhere in good old 3-dimensional space. In level 3, they live on another quantum branch in an infinite dimensional Hilbert space. Similarly, all level 2 bubble universes with different physical constants can in fact be found as worlds created by splits at the moment of spontaneous symmetry breaking in a level 3 multiverse. Anyway, the matter of whether there could exist universes with completely different deep down laws of physics is something that neither cosmology nor string theory, for that matter, can actually even address in terms of empirical confirmation. We do need to remember that not even reason can produce something out of nothing. Reason cannot get more out of its premises than what is implicitly invested in them. Anyway, I would like to end my introductory comments with the famous final sentences of Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, a book that almost everyone bought, even if they did not actually end up reading it. And I quote, "If we do discover a complete theory, it should in time be understandable in broad principle by everyone, not just a few scientists. Then we shall, all philosophers, scientists, and just ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of the question of why it is that we and the universe exist. If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God."
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Priya. Michael?
Yeah.
Over here.
Sorry. I wonder if there's a significance to the ordering that science, then philosophy, and then whatever it is that Dennis does. Yeah, there's some kind of implicit hierarchy. I didn't plan this ordering, but I'm not a physicist, and even more, I'm not a philosopher of physics. I'm just a philosopher. But I'm an interested observer in these topics, and I do want to say a bit here about the historical background of our guiding question, why is there anything at all, and about the meaning of that question. Sidney Morgenbesser, a philosopher, is said to have dismissed Heidegger's question, why is there something rather than nothing, by saying, well, if there were nothing, you'd still be complaining. That was one of Morgenbesser's famous quips that illustrates a deep philosophical point, too. But like Morgenbesser, other philosophers have of late tended to stay away from this kind of deeply puzzling question. Why have they tended to stay away from this question? One reason has been the influential attacks of Hume and Kant especially, and others, on the ontological and cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Arguments that have been among the hallmarks of a rationalist approach to philosophy, which tries to see everything as intelligible. The cosmological argument, just a very rough and crude overview, the cosmological argument claims that there are things that are not self-caused, like you and me and the tables and the chairs, and given the principle of sufficient reason, which I was very happy to see Priya refer to, but not under that name, she said that all facts have explanations. She was committed to that, right? So that's what the principle of sufficient reason says. All facts have explanations. Everything that exists has an explanation. Bravo, Priya, right? And so, So given the principle of sufficient reason, which says that, it follows that these non-self-explanatory things, these non-self-cause things, could exist only if there were a self-cause being, a self-explanatory being. And so the cosmological argument concludes that this self-explanatory being is God. There's more to that argument than that, but that's the rough structure. Now, for the cosmological argument to appeal to a self-explanatory being in this way, as Kant noted, to appeal to a being whose nature it is to exist, whose existence in some sense follows from its essence, or to put another way, a being who has existence built into its essence. But to say that there is a being whose existence follows from its essence is, in effect, to rely on the traditional ontological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument, again, very roughly, is the argument that God exists because existence is part of the essence of God. It's part of the concept of God. It's part of the definition of God, as it were. One of Kant's great insights, and he had a few others too, but this is one of them, was that the cosmological argument for the existence of God bottoms out with, or rests on, the ontological argument for the existence of God. To deploy such arguments at the cosmological and the ontological argument, and also to deploy the principle of sufficient reason, is in effect to regard no why question as in principle unanswerable, to regard everything as in principle intelligible. So Kant then saw that in order to criticize both of those, a lot of arguments for the existence of God, he needed to attack the ontological argument. And his criticism of the ontological argument has been tremendously influential. Hume has a similar point, but Kant made it most effectively. His criticism is this: existence for Kant is not a predicate. Existence is not a property like redness or squareness or blueness. Those properties like redness or squareness or blueness could be built into the concept of a thing, could be built into the definition of a thing. But existence, Kant says, and others have said this too, is a condition for having any properties at all. It's not a property in its own right, so it's not eligible to be part of the essence of anything, right? If it were part of the essence of anything, it would be part of the essence of everything, and so that would trivialize the ontological argument. That was the core of Kant's criticism of the ontological argument. And most philosophers since Kant simply take this criticism of the ontological argument for granted. Most philosophers, not all by any means, but most. And most philosophers just have tendency to accept that existence is not a predicate. And with that acceptance, the triumph of Kant on that point, the age of speculative metaphysics, the age of the commitment to the intelligibility of all things, was dealt a significant blow. Rationalism is dealt a significant blow by Kant, a blow from which rationalism is not yet fully recovered, right? So this is I'm giving you an historical overview here. So this is my potted history of the question. So what Kant did, he said he denied that everything, we could use the principle of sufficient reason in this way. He denied that we can deploy the ontological argument. And so what he said is we couldn't prove that God exists. He said we have to famously deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. That was Kant's strategy. And so the big questions, such as why is there anything at all, our question for this conference, these questions tended to migrate out of philosophy after Kant. Not completely. Some philosophers fell back, but these questions tended to migrate out of philosophy, and they became more exclusively the province of fields like theology, where they have rightly thrived. Later developments in philosophy, if you can call them developments, such as logical positivism, which branded all or most metaphysics as, well, nonsense, that was the term, as nonsense, those kinds of criticisms of metaphysics were extreme views in the spirit of Kant's critique of rationalist metaphysics, right? But whereas at least Kant wanted to leave room for faith, as he said, logical positivists, and many, though not all, later philosophers, didn't want even to do that. And so the tendency of philosophy to avoid this kind of big question that we're discussing in this conference, the tendency to avoid that question was only strengthened. But of late, this tendency in philosophy has been changing a bit. And this conference is, and the people, many of the people here, is a big manifestation of that change. There are many reasons for this change in philosophical attitude of late, And among these reasons are, of course, recent developments in physics that Priya was outlining, and that I am not qualified to speak about, but Priya was explaining it. These developments in physics have pushed up against these traditional questions, or have seemed to push up against these traditional questions, and to make them more salient. So this is one of the things that forced philosophy of late to take these questions seriously again. Another feature that's led philosophy to take these questions seriously again has been internal changes in philosophy itself. Changes whereby metaphysics has come back into favor. Thank God it's come back into favor. But this is lots of things have brought metaphysics back onto the table as a central part of philosophy. And so even these big questions have made a comeback within philosophy. Instead of narrowing their focus, at least some philosophers now are prepared to take bolder steps and not to be beholden to common sense or to mere intuitions. Instead, they are guided by, they want to be bolder and to take on these metaphysical questions more directly. And all this is well and good, I think. And so we have the question of this conference: why is there anything at all? It's a big question, if ever there was one. And this question is a loaded question, too, because this very question raises several further, perhaps deeper questions. And these questions are all tied to the notions or concepts of the words employed by the question, why is there anything at all? So I want to do a little philosophical analysis of this question to raise even deeper questions. So part of what I'm saying here is that the question that Priya and Dennis came up with is not the right question to be asking. There are even deeper questions to be asking. So let's try to see, by analyzing our question, why is there anything rather than nothing? Or why is there something at all? First, there's the word why, which calls up the demand for an explanation. But here's a deep question, and Priya raised this question. What is an explanation? What counts as a good explanation? Are the only kinds of legitimate explanations scientific explanations? But what are scientific explanations anyway? What is, Priya was gesturing at some of what it might amount to, but is that the only kind of legitimate explanation? Aren't all explanations the same kind of thing, an effort to make something plain or clear? And aren't they all on the same level? And another related question, can we accept that certain why questions are off limits? Certain why questions are not legitimately to be asked? That certain matters don't have an explanation, or even worse, that certain facts or certain matters don't demand an explanation at all? Is the distinction between things that demand an explanation and things that don't demand an explanation itself a distinction that's in need of explanation? How are we to draw the line between why questions that are off limits and those that are not off limits? These are questions that come up when we start investigating the notion of explanation. I don't have answers to these questions, or at least I'm not going to present them here, but these are ones that I hope that we think about during this conference. Let's take a look at another notion, the next notion in our guiding question, why is there anything? And that's the notion of is, the notion of existence. What is existence anyway? What is it for a thing to exist? Does anyone have a good answer to this question? Sometimes it seems not. Philosophers tend to treat this notion of existence as a primitive, as something that's not subject to further analysis, or not subject to further explanation. But isn't there anything that we can say to make the notion of existence less opaque? And further, isn't there a demand that existence itself be explained? Philosophers often, in many cases, are willing to demand that certain other fundamental notions be explained, that there be an account given of certain fundamental notions. For example, fundamental notions such as necessity, causation. People demand an account of causation. What is it for one thing to cause another? So causation, necessity, philosophers are demanding accounts of those things in many cases. Consciousness, many philosophers have demanded an account of what consciousness is. Mentality in general, many philosophers have demanded an account of what mentality is. They seek to explain it. So why shouldn't existence itself also be something that can be explained in this kind of way? Right? So there's a demand for explanation, and that demand may go to the very notion of existence itself. And that's something that I would like to consider, whether that kind of demand's in place to explain the notion of existence. And I think that's certainly a question worth exploring, and especially worthy of exploration is the connection between the first notion I mentioned, the why notion, explanation, and the notion of existence. Is there some kind, I'm just raising this question now, is there some kind of essential connection between existence and explanation, such that in order for a thing to exist, it must be capable of being explained? And indeed, that kind of essential connection is indicated by the principle of sufficient reason itself. I'll call it Priya's principle from now on. So that there's some kind of connection between existence and explanation itself. What it is for a thing to exist is to be intelligible, is to be subject to explanation. If this is the case, then the notion of existence would be more robust than Kant thought it was. Perhaps existence, if it's something like intelligibility, would after all be a genuine property, would after all be a predicate, contrary to what Kant said. So these are just questions for us to consider as you try to unpack our guiding question. I'm not proposing any answers here. But let me just ask another question in my questioning frame of mind. If existence turns out to be a predicate because a notion of existence is inherently tied to the notion of explanation, then do we bring something like the ontological argument for the existence of God back into the picture? Well, perhaps we do, because that was Kant's main criticism of the ontological argument. And if we do bring something like the ontological argument back into the picture, what kind of God would this be which has existence built into its essence? Would this be anything like God in a traditional sense? Could the notion of intelligibility and existence being connected together, could that lead us to a traditional creator God? Or would this have to be God in some kind of naturalistic, non-traditional sense, perhaps like Spinoza, whom Priya also mentioned? So what kind of God gets proved by the ontological argument is a question that's also worth considering. So much for the words why and is. So we're making progress, right? Why is there anything at all, right? So we did why and is. Another word, or a part of a word that's worthy of exploration in our guiding question is the word thing. What is it to be a thing? What are the requirements for being a thing? Is the notion of thing, perhaps like the notion of existence, primitive, not subject to further analysis? Or is there more to say about what it is to be a thing? Perhaps, as in the case of existence, as I said, it's a notion, thingness is a notion that's not to be explained. But without an account of what it is to be a thing, can we be sure that anything, in fact, meets the requirements for being a thing? And can we be sure that even that the requirements for being a thing are coherent? If the requirements for being a thing are not coherent, then perhaps there are no things at all. So perhaps an even deeper question than the question that guides the conference is there anything at all? That's the question I think that we have to take this seriously. So we've got why is there anything? Thing was the third notion. Why is thing? What about at? I'm not going to do a philosophical analysis of the notion of at, although actually people have done that. I mean, I'm serious. People have, at is a very significant philosophical word, but I'm going to stop with my philosophical analysis there. Now, of course, the deeper questions I'm raising, what is explanation? What is existence? What is a thing? And also the question, is there anything at all? May seem scarcely intelligible or may seem deeply intractable, and we may not have any hope of ever being able to answer them. But I just want to say two things. These deeper, perhaps weirder questions may have to be addressed in order for us to make headway on the guiding question of our conference, why is there anything at all? And the second point I want to make is that if we have learned anything from physics, and I have not learned anything from physics myself, but if we have learned anything from physics, it's that in order to make progress in explanation, in order to make progress in scientific explanation, we may need to venture into unexplored or deeply counterintuitive territory. The same is, I believe, no less true of philosophy. Philosophical explanations often, and perhaps at their best, lead us to abandon our intuitive views in order to try to satisfy our deeper commitment to finding things intelligible. It is in the spirit of this deeper commitment that I hope that we will be exploring this weekend the question, why is there anything at all? Thank you very much.
I think I'll stand up here too. This new reading of PSR, the Principle of Sufficient Reason, as Priya's sufficient reason is somewhat ambiguous. It raises the question as to whether there's a sufficient reason for Priya. But anyway, we'll allow that in. When that is to say, Priya, Michael and I envisaged this conference in the first instance, I thought this question, why is there anything at all, was very exciting, sounded very enticing, sounded possibly enticing to all three parties concerned. But at the back of my mind, there was this troubling thought that would occur to me sharply at 3 o'clock in the morning when I thought in a panicky way about the organisation of this conference, otherwise than in terms as to whether the caterers would turn up with the food, was a little saying that one learnt years and years ago: ask a silly question and you'll get nothing but silly answers. And I kind of thought to myself, have we got a silly question which just sounds as if it has a lot of weighty meaning to it and is one that can be answered intelligibly by virtue of having the sort of conference which we have in fact organised? Well, frankly, as one of the organisers of this conference, I'm perfectly happy with the possibility that having an enjoyable journey of discussion on the way, we might very well, when we get to the destination, conclude that the question doesn't really make a great deal of sense, but that it was worthwhile discovering just that. I say this simply because I think it's important in understanding this conference that none of us come to it, including the organisers, with any axes to grind, just simply a sense of profound puzzlement. Among other things, I think this is what Michael has raised for us, among other things, about the question itself. So there's a sort of second-order aspect to the whole discussion, which I suspect is going to be found continually running through all the attempts to engage in the kind of conversation which we hope that the raising of this question will produce. One of the reasons, in any case, why we thought that it was worthwhile giving the conference the title, Why Anything, was that it was almost certainly going to be, as a question, equally puzzling to all three parties, that none of them had a proprietary interest either in necessarily seeing it off or necessarily, as it were, taking possession of it as just theirs. And I say that because I think it's really quite important, speaking as I do, as a person of theological interest, that I do not suppose that this question is itself an inherently theological question. I think it may be that this is the only way into doing theology, but I don't think that it is one which necessarily guarantees that that's a possibility. So for me, speaking as a theologian, the question why anything is a central, not a marginal puzzle. In other words, if it turns out to be a silly question, then it turns out that theology as a whole is a set of silly answers. And that may very well be one of the outcomes. This is one of the things about disciplines like philosophy and theology. They spend a great deal of time investigating the question as to whether there's anything to be done in them, whether there is anything there that is worthwhile discussion. Whereas you scientists have an easy time. You've got something that you can always get on with doing without having to interrogate it in quite the way in which we, as it were, put the interrogation of the subject on the agenda of the subject itself. And that, I think, is going to mean that there's a certain asymmetry in the kinds of conversation, the kinds of contributions to the conversation which we're likely to have. And I don't suppose for 1 minute that there is, as it were, a fourth vocabulary, a fourth level of language, which exists somehow or other as meta in relation to all three of them, which is going to be generated out of this. If there were, I suspect it would be a kind of gobbledygook, which all of us would have an interest in not engaging in. So point number one, as far as I'm concerned, is there is no proprietary theological interest in this question, as if somehow or other, if there's an answer to it, you've got God in one go. I don't think that. I think, however, and I think Michael has done quite a lot, and in her own way so has Priya, to offer a sort of account of the plausibility of this, that it isn't necessarily the case that just because a question, the answer to a question, is something which would be beyond our ken, that in itself guarantees that the question itself is not worth asking. In other words, there is justification for asking questions concerning the answer to which one knows in advance that it is unavailable to us, in the sense of availability which is proper to our own disciplines. This, I think, is the sort of anti-Kantian proposition which Michael was pointing to. If one remains within the captivity, as it were, of the Kantian position, which I see roughly as meaning this, that if it's a sensible question, then you've got guarantees as to what counts as the trajectory moving towards its answer. And I think that, for me, one of the reasons why it's important to continue to stick to raising this question is that it keeps in play the very notion of the possibility of a question which makes sense, to which one knows that we won't have access to the answer within the territory or the domain of knowledge within which the question makes sense. So that it does, in some way or other, take us all out of our skins to entertain this question in different ways. And that, I think, is probably one of the main purposes of this conference, to get us all to think, as it were, outside our own territories, even if, as I say, there is no common language which we can then engage in, which stands in that relationship of a meta-language in relation to all of them. So maybe there are some questions which perforce you have to ask, short of some kind of epistemological prescription in advance that determines what counts as a sensible question. So maybe there are some questions that you have to ask, to which, therefore, one takes it that there has to be an answer, even though the nature of that answer may inherently be beyond us. I have the impression that something analogous to this is contained in what, at least level 3 of multiverse talk. Because here, I suppose, the reason why one talks in such terms is that there are certain things one believes the explanation of requires the hypothesis of there being a multiverse level 3, but that it is in the nature of multiverse level 3 that we're not in a position to give descriptions of it, because the laws in terms of which we are able to offer intelligible descriptions, just in the nature of the hypothesis of a multiverse, don't apply. Yeah? And therefore, here we would have a case which at least functions in some way analogously to the sort of generic case that I was making. Here we have a specific case of an hypothesis of something which is required for the possibility of explanation of what we do observe, which is in itself inherently unobservable. I think it was the possibility that there might be some analogies going on here that cause us to think that, well, it's worth the risk having a conference which puts right up front in the very title a question the intelligibility of which may very well be unsustainable and indefensible. And that, as I say, it may very well be the outcome. I don't think that, for me, it's a great problem if it turns out that this is a silly question and that therefore there are only silly answers to it, because in the end I'm a theologian and I'm quite happy with answers that most people regard as silly, and I may have just to live with that. But anyway, I think the journey is fun, even if the point of arrival is, well, somewhat odd. But anyway, there we go. Thank you. Now, at this point, we three, having, as I think, probably just given some account as to why it was that we thought it was worthwhile calling you guys together to engage with us, now I think we just leave it open for a little while and see how it goes. And when we discover that we've baffled everybody at this stage and that nobody has anything to say, we'll go off and have a cup of coffee. But just for the time being.
Yeah, I think we'd really appreciate sort of comments, thoughts, reflections.
Exactly. I think in the more open spirit in which we've opened this question, we'll have more technical and more focused papers. Yes, Peter.
Excuse me, can I just make a quick announcement
Yes.
about the technology? There's several hundred people enjoying this with us by our streaming capability. In order for them to hear you, if you could please turn your mic on when you want to speak. I know there's a temptation to figure, he's just over there, so why do I have to do that? But if you will do that, that would service the people who are with us remotely. And then you just turn it off. There's a little red light on your microphone, and you just punch it off and punch it on. The other thing is that for legal reasons, we're going to provide you a release to sign saying that we can do what we're already doing. But we'll do that later. Thank you.
Peter.
So I have a question for Priya about something she said almost at the very beginning of her talk about physicists being more and astronomers being more happy with how questions than why questions. But I wonder if you aren't coming down on the purpose related functions of why, because it has other functions too. It seems to me, looking at physics from the outside, physics is always explaining to me why things are the case. So Kepler observes that the planets move in elliptical orbits with the sun at one focus. It seems to me that Newton explained why that is the case.
Rather than how, or in addition?
Well, Kepler showed how the planets move.
Yeah.
Newton then, by stating a couple of very basic principles like a central force law and maybe an observation about the total energy of the system, you can deduce from that that the planets move in elliptical orbits with the sun at one foot with us from a certain set of basic assumptions. Isn't that explaining why they do
it is,
in
but
terms of something else, of course, but all explanations are in terms of something.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I want to clarify here that the point here was that without the data that Kepler and Brahe brought to the table, I think a why question and a response to why things work was not really possible. So it follows from a how exploration. So I guess I was using how as a proxy for empirical data and observation as what spurs on. Yeah, but I take your point.
There are a couple of hands up, but I think Janet got yours up first, if you could.
Priya, it's another question to you. Thank you for just a brilliant paper. I understood it, which makes me worried. And indeed for all three of you. But it concerns your statement earlier on that reality isn't, that working astrophysicists believe that reality is intelligible through and through, which I'm delighted to hear. But I wondered about the status of that claim. Is it a working premise? Is it something derived from experience? Where does this come from? I think Einstein said something similar, didn't he? The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Is this just a gut feeling? Or is it a working premise, or what's the status of this claim?
I knew I would get backed into corners. But I think it would be fair to say, I should here ask Joel and Doug to back me up, that this is a working premise. Would you agree that reality is comprehensible?
I take it as an article of faith, really exactly in the religious sense, that moreover, that we scientists, physicists in particular, have our faith confirmed whenever we have a success. And the most remarkable thing of all is that we have success frequently.
Right.
So it's this sort of circular thing where we assume as an article of faith that previously unintelligible aspects of reality will become intelligible.
Eventually, with technology, observations, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have this faith constantly confirmed. but in no sense does that prove that this is true. Because whenever we're confronted with a difficult problem, we have to go back on the faith. And in fact, that's what really sees us through.
Right. So actually, Doug, could you?
I just want to make a quick comment from the point of view of an applied physicist. I basically agree with the thrust of your answer, but I would say that this article of faith has proved to transform the face of the earth and the nature of human life in an astonishing way that could be seen from space and so on. So if we know anything, we know that this hypothesis has been incredibly successful and valuable in the last 500 years or maybe 2,000, however far back you want to go. So this is an article of faith that I think we should put a lot of confidence in.
Yep. Could you put your microphone on, please, sir?
We philosophers have our faith confirmed whenever we have a failure. Philosophy. I was thinking, though, more seriously about if one thinks, for example, about what the Greeks could have known. Well, they didn't have the conceptual tools. They didn't have the calculus, at least not maybe until Archimedes, in order to construct the kinds of theories that were constructed later. And I guess that's maybe a thought, is that we don't have the conceptual tools and maybe can't acquire the conceptual tools in order to formulate and answer certain questions. It's not a working faith, of course, but it's a worry that, I don't know, the history of the subject might suggest.
I don't know. I mean, I would argue that the Greeks did have the heliocentric. I mean, the idea was there. They just didn't have the data to back it up. I mean, that's how I read it.
They would have had trouble with differential equations, though.
They might have had, but I think most importantly, I think they didn't have data to back it up, which is why the whole idea kind of fell dead for a very long time before it was sort of resurrected by Copernicus.
Again, we've got a bit of a queue. I think you're next, and then, yeah.
So this really, I think, is another take on Barry's question. It seems to me that the question about how much of the world is intelligible is not just a question about how the world is, it's also a question about how the mind is. And hence it's an empirical question about human cognitive architecture.
Yes.
And, if you think about it from a naturalistic standpoint, it seems like it would be quite remarkable if a brain that was built for things like finding mates and avoiding tigers was able to understand everything as it truly is. In fact, on a theological assumption, it's not clear that we should expect that either.
Mm.
I think George wanted to come. All right. Julian Barber. Some of the things Michael said really rang true to me. And I just wonder about also the nature of explanation and existence. I'm hugely impressed by what happened with ancient astronomy with the Greeks. The Babylonians made very good observations and had algorithms which predicted eclipses.
Yes.
The Greeks saw the same mysterious, erratic, two-dimensional motions on the sky, and to explain them, it's not just making plain, they posited a third dimension. They posited something they could not see and said, within that third dimension, motions are very beautiful and uniform. And that's really, for me, is the beginning of science. And I think it's very interesting that to explain what you can see, you postulated something that you couldn't see, and it worked. Now, does that perhaps have something very deep to say about when we can talk about something existing? I know it perhaps only pushes the things one step further away. There's always sort of a regress involved in this, but it still strikes me as a very remarkable fact and a very remarkable achievement. And that is really where science started, in my opinion. It is with the Greeks with their, physics. Well, geometry was the first thing with Euclid, but then it went on with the physics, the astronomy, with the astronomers.
I think that the notion that explanation often turns to things that you can't see to explain the things that you can see. that fits in with what I was saying, where I was saying that philosophers often need to go beyond common sense or mere intuitions, because the ultimate explanation for things won't be immediately apparent to us, and we need to take the data that's given to us and explain them in other terms, which is perhaps, or less familiar terms. So my little talk was about encouraging people to go to counterintuitive explanations, because that's often that's borne out by what you say, that often the real explanations have to appeal to things that are initially might seem implausible, but then that's not a problem.
Yeah, and beautifully also confirmed with Galileo arguing for the motion of the Earth.
Sure.
Thank you for those really nice introductory talks. I want to just concentrate on what Priya said, because it really showed the strange state of cosmology today. There's more and more observations, incredible experiments, wonderful data. But at a fundamental level, to explain them, cosmologists are relying on less and less testable hypotheses. And that's really, really quite strange. And particularly, I just want to focus on one thing. When you talked about the multiverse, you kept using the word infinite. Now, I'm going to invoke in this meeting what I call Hilbert's golden rule. Whenever the word infinite is used in a physical explanation, it's a fake explanation, because infinity is not a physical state. The concept of infinity is a state that can never, ever, ever be attained. And people are using the word infinite casually as if it's a simple thing that you can just toss around without thinking about it. I'm going to stick with that, and I'm going to push this view. If the word infinite is used as an essential part of an explanation, it is a fake explanation. It's not a real explanation.
Agreed.
Yes? No, that's you. Yeah.
I'd like to get back to the question you raised, Dennis, about whether we're going to get silly answers to the possibly silly question. Because, I mean, one of the things that puzzles me is that, and it really also applies to this issue about whether reality is intelligible. Whether something is intelligible from a scientific point of view, or whether an answer is sensible from a scientific point of view, is not the same as the answer would be given by a philosopher and a theologian. I mean, everybody accepts that science has got a limited domain of applicability. One may disagree with George. I think I disagree with George, for example, about precisely where the boundaries are, but everybody agrees that there is a boundary between science and philosophy. So there are questions which are sensible from a philosophical point of view, but which are not sensible from a scientific point of view. And maybe there's another boundary also between philosophy and theology. So there are these different boundaries, so that the whole question of the issue of whether an answer is silly depends precisely on whether you're addressing it as a scientist or a philosopher or a theologian. And of course that's what's interesting about this meeting, that we're all coming together. So that's why I was slightly puzzled by this remark, because, I mean, are we all going to agree as to what's silly or not?
Well, I think my concern is that if you simply take the view that a question gets its sense from the particular context of methodology of answering it, then you're allowing questions that what accounts for the intelligibility of a question to be determined by the procedures that you have in place for answering it. And one of the things that it occurred to us, I suppose, about this question is that actually that rather disables that excessively tight connection between what counts as a sensible question and what counts as an answer. Or to put it very, very simply, I think we were all equally puzzled by it, although the puzzlement may very well, as you say, have arisen out of different intellectual contexts. So I think the question is open in this sense, that it's not only a question which is inherently open, it's open in the sense that it's not a question that belongs within a particular discipline. There is no discipline of asking just that question. And so to some extent it is inherently a meta question, which is raising questions about what's going on in different disciplines. So, and that's what I meant when I said, in a somewhat apparently skeptical, non-defense of my own discipline, that there is a certain sense in which I don't regard this as an inherently theological question. And I think that was important from the point of view of the construction of this conference, because otherwise it would look as if the question was begged in favor of a question which makes sense within theology, but probably doesn't within the other disciplines. And you guys had better watch out for us because we've got the real question going. Do you see what I mean? And I wanted to get away from that because it seemed to me the character of the question as being equally puzzling across the board had something going for it, even though it might have derived that question just from its being silly, right? And that, I think, is something which we have to explore. But Neil, you wanted to...
Yeah, Neil Arner, I wanted to interrogate Dennis's claim there about not having anything at stake in this question. If it turns out that this question is meaningless or is unanswerable, doesn't that put pressure on your theological convictions? Doesn't that, or do you have two ways of knowing, one of which is grounded in knowledge and one of which is completely removed from knowledge?
I would want to distinguish between whether the question is askable and whether it's answerable, because I think that there is a distinction there. And what I was just saying now was, don't suppose that a question is only worth asking only if we have agreed and standard procedures for answering it. And the reason why I said that was because, as I'll explain later today when I have an opportunity, or rather an obligation, to say some things that I'd rather not find myself having to say in front of all you lot, that I think if you ask yourself, well, what's going on in things like the arguments for the existence of God that Michael raised here, my answer from within my own discipline, which is actually medieval theology, is if you look at what Thomas Aquinas says about this, he says, look, the arguments for the existence of God demonstrate by arguments which he regards as both valid and sound, the existence of something which those same arguments also demonstrate we can't know the nature of. That there has to be something, the nature of which we can't know, which accounts for that which we do know. And that, I think, begins to disrupt that excessively neat connection between, well, what counts as a sensible procedure for answering questions and what determines whether a question makes sense to ask. And so I think that distinction for me was what was important, not to sort of skeptically dump the whole business of theology because it rests upon the intelligibility of that question, which it seems to me it does, but it doesn't rest on the intelligibility of the answer. On the contrary, if you take a mainstream theologian like Thomas Aquinas, it's hugely important to recognize that the answer to that question could not belong within the territory of meaning and sense from which the question arises. And it's Kant who I think drives a coach and horses through this possibility, through that disjunction. Do you see?
I think Tim.
Go on. I mean, I'm going back because it was a while ago, and I guess it's probably the first of a lot of complaints I'm going to have. I mean, the first comment I want to make was the idea that this notion of the intelligibility of the universe was an article of faith for cosmologists, and you said, but it's we get evidence or we get successes all the time. I take it that means it's not an article of faith. That is, I always thought an article of faith was the sort of thing you only believed in because you had to have faith, whereas in fact we know the world is, to some degree, in fact to a tremendously large degree, intelligible, to a tremendously large degree intelligible by minds that developed in evolution in the savannah. Really interesting. That's just a fact, right? I don't take that to be an article of faith. There's a question of how far that intelligibility goes. And I guess the second thing I just wanted to point out was when Michael was talking, he would say things like, well, are certain questions legitimate? Do certain things demand explanation? I take it only we demand explanations, right? Things don't demand explanations. We like to have explanations. We like to have them as much as we can. I take it if we look at the physical universe, in certain ways it looks extremely orderly, and we think there's an explanation for that. And in certain ways it looks extremely random, right? In certain details of the initial conditions, details of the exact precise locations of things and numbers of stars and numbers of hairs on your head and so on, look actually quite random. To say that they demand explanations, I mean, it might be you get back to an initial state, and it is what it is, and it could have been different. And if that makes you unhappy, well, you know, as they say on the internet, call the wambulance, right? I mean, too bad, right? You have to live with it. I take it that that's a perfectly coherent possibility, and that we ought to avoid demands for explanation and actually look at where, you know, how much we can get. And if we get to a point where we can't get more, I don't see any reason to think, well, there must be one we can't find. The last comment I just want to say is very quickly, because Michael got into some, you know, philosophical arguments. You said something and then you skipped over it. I just want to say this. I've never understood this Kantian stuff about existence is not a predicate, right? There's a predicate in English, exists, okay? I've never understood what it is to say existence isn't a property. I think it's correct to say, here's an easy thing. What is the essence of something? The tie nenai, as Plato would say, right? So you give the essence of something by saying what would be required for it to exist. So for water, you might find out you need 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, and they have to exist, right? In order for water to exist, they have to exist. I think existence is part of the essence of everything. It's a trivial one. As you said, you mentioned it, but then put it aside. You said, maybe it's trivial. I think it is. Of course, existence is part of the essence of God and of the table and of me and of everything, but that means you're not going to get any interesting arguments out of it. You particularly won't get that something that has existence as part of its essence is a necessary being. That's the mistake that people make. So that's just
You're agreeing with Kant. I mean, because that's exactly what Kant says, that if existence is a predicate, it's a trivial predicate, right? And I was raising the possibility that it's not a trivial predicate in this way, that and that one could perhaps get a necessary being of some kind out of it. And that was because I was taking seriously this notion of a demand for explanation, that everything is such that it is subject to explanation. So we could have a discussion about Priya's principle of sufficient reason here, because that was in the background of what I was saying. And you were, in effect, happy to say that the principle of sufficient reason might be false. You know, the explanation may just peter out somewhere, and so much, you know, the worse for us, right? And I wasn't so sure of that, because I'm more, it's not an article of faith for me. I agree with what you're saying about it shouldn't be an article of faith, but I think that there is more to be said about once we look into what existence is, it may be that existence is built in, being subject to explanation is built into the concept of existence itself. And I think that may be something that's presupposed in a lot of our inquiries in general. So that's a somewhat a different perspective from which I was coming.
If I may comment briefly, I think my personal position is definitely one of working premise rather than article of faith, just to clarify. Yeah.
I'm kind of picking up the people who haven't spoken before those who have, even if they're out of order. So did you want to intervene now? I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah. No, you. Yeah, okay, yeah.
This is going back to talk of the... I'm sorry. This is going back to talk of the infinite. Again, this is an old debate. Aristotle only believed in potential infinity as opposed to actual infinity. A big development in mathematics was towards the end of the 19th century, when Cantor developed the idea of an actual infinity and built his theory of transfinite cardinal numbers on the basis of that. That was a huge development in mathematics. There's probably, actually Hilbert himself said, no more drivers from Cantor's paradise. So in mathematics now, as a general rule, people accept the idea of a complete infinity. I see absolutely, I mean, now Hilbert himself had certain philosophical prejudices that led him to deny the existence of infinity. He wanted to see mathematics in completely finite terms. I don't see why we should follow Hilbert in those prejudices. And I don't see any reason at all why we should rule out from the start of inquiry the idea that the physical universe might be something like an actual infinity. I mean, maybe there are there's good reason on the basis of some evidence that we have, but a priori it just seems to me absurd to do that. So I'm kind of surprised that the scientists, a couple of scientists here seem to be wanting to rule this out a priori.
I think I don't want to rule it out, but I just took his point. Yeah. I did not state my position. Yeah.
John, I think you come next, and then me.
So this is not about infinity. If you want to go on with infinity, take somebody else.
There'll be time for infinity.
Okay, you take up that then, and then.
I just wanted to come in on that infinity one, and I think that's it. There is this convention of holding up a finger when you want to continue a subject and two fingers if you're changing it or something. That might be useful because coming in on the infinity. I just want to say on that very interesting observation, but I do agree with George in many ways. Einstein praised Mach for his ideas about the origin of inertia and that it required a spatially closed universe. And Einstein praised it because he said only then can you close the circle of cause and effect. And I think a really truly satisfying explanation somehow does need that closing of the circle, which I think is perhaps a little bit behind what George was saying. And despite what the wonders of mathematics are and the paradise of the infinity, I think there is still something to be said for being able to close the universe in that way.
Well, on that principle, John, do you mind if George just has a quick word and then we'll take you?
I just want to, I'm willing to develop this much further, but I just want to make one point now. I believe the core of science is being able to test your hypotheses. There is no way you can ever test any claim that anything is infinite for the very simple reason that if you could see them, which you can't, you cannot count them in any finite time, so you can never ever prove anything infinite exists. So if you want to claim it's a scientific concept, I claim it is not for that very simple reason that I believe the core of science is being able to test the claims that you're making.
Right. John, I think you've been very patient. Your turn.
So we've had a certain narrative of intellectual history proposed that for example, Aquinas, you can have intelligible questions that require an answer outside the frame of reference of the question. And that this was all blown to smithereens by Kant. And I just wanted to mention the first sentence of the first critique, which is that reason has this peculiar fate, that we are bound to ask questions that by the very nature of our reason we're unable to answer. And that these questions take us beyond the understanding for their answer. We have to have the faith that they have an answer, but it's not going to be one that we understand within the limits of our own understanding.
I think there still remains the question as to whether what's the difference between a question which has to have an answer but we can't know what it is, and a question which we just couldn't answer and know that you couldn't answer. So there are still criteria of the rationality of a question which enables us to distinguish between genuine questions which have no answer, demonstrably have no answer, and spurious questions which, because they're spurious, don't have answers. So I think one still needs a test of what makes for a good question in some form or other, and I'm not quite sure what that test is.
But I mean, but Dennis, isn't that predicated on a fundamental article of faith as to whether everything is knowable or not?
I've been listening to this conversation with fascination. I'm not sure what my answer to that question is, to be honest with you. Kind of caught between two positions.
Billy Grassi. So yesterday I was at a conference at Columbia on Buddhist philosophy, so that was my nothingness day. and now I'm at a conference at Yale on somethingness. So I'm transitioning here. But isn't a different kind of question, and maybe even more complicated, is why this something, rather than, it's a particular universe, it's a particular 13.7 billion year evolution of the universe and the earth and human history, and doesn't that why this something raise a whole bunch of different kind of questions that might be even more compelling and more complex?
Well, I think that would be the direction that someone like me would pull it. You see, I would pull it in that direction. And one of the reasons why we wanted to pose something a question that no particular discipline could kind of pull and figure, transmute into something that they can answer, was to find something that was slightly more meta. But I think it would be fair to say that the sort of cosmologists' sort of preoccupation with these kinds of questions would really be why this universe, why these initial conditions, and how they came to be. Yeah, I agree. I think Doug has his hand up for a while.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Hi, so Doug Stone. I wanted to comment on the infinity question because it pertains to my own philosophy of science, being now an active scientist for 30 years and seeing how science progresses. I think that the idea of testability in any simple, in any simple notion in science is just too simplistic a way to define what we do. I tend towards Quine's web of belief, which I've seen proven over and over again in scientific practice, that we have central beliefs, which are relatively far from experience and relatively untestable. And then we have the fringe where we're taking in data and confronting empirical events. And generally, it's very difficult for those empirical events to dislodge our most fundamental beliefs, but it could happen. And we had the experience in mathematics of finding that the axioms of mathematics were no longer simple and self-evident, and that in some sense they are empirical. There was the famous Russell paradox and the axiom of choice, where we had to actually sort of define our arithmetic in some aesthetic way. So at the center of our understanding of the world are these core beliefs, which are relatively untestable, but we may eventually change in response to some complex set of contradictions or tensions, which we did with quantum mechanics at the beginning of the 20th century. So I don't find infinity any more objectionable than 100 other things that I use all the time in doing my science that are relatively core, untestable things that organize how we look at the world, and which have proved their worth, and then in some catastrophic case, we might imagine amending some of them, as has happened historically.
We can go on a bit more.
Yeah, we'll keep the discussion going just for a bit longer, I think, and perhaps another 10, 15 minutes, something like that, and then, Sorry, I think it's the gentleman behind you.
Don Mender. I want to introduce another term into this discussion, anxiety. I think we haven't really touched on that aspect of the discussion. I think there was some reference to our cognitive abilities, the ones that have evolved under selective pressures. But there are also, I think, there's an emotional side to this. And I think it reaches into each of the three disciplines that have been brought to bear on the question. In philosophical terms, one of the responses to Kant's observation about the non-predicative nature of existence, as he saw it, it was logical positivism, but another was existentialism. And one might think of existence in terms of subjectivity, and our asking the question as Dasein, as that mode of existence that questions its own existence, and that leads to existential anxiety. It's a way of kind of knowing about, having an intuition of existence, at least one's own. I think also existentialism, as I understand it, had a lot to say about faith. Certainly Kierkegaard did. And I would argue that anxiety enters into the practice of science as well, particularly those paradigmatic shifts that threaten the center of the scientific subject, like, for example, the Copernican revolution, in which there was tremendous resistance to a shift of our Earth and the subject of science, the scientist, away from the center of the universe. I think that's happened a number of times. Another way of thinking about the anxiety inherent in science is to think about Hume's fork and the idea that we really can't be sure, even if we, as one person has pointed out, can point to a lot of evidence of our own competence in the past in being able to make predictions and technologically control the world, that will operate in the future. The argument from the past to the future is always, from Hume's point of view, suspect. So we're left with anxiety in all of these spheres. And of course, the introductory comments by President Levin were, one of the things that President Levin said was that we all might get very upset by the discussion that follows, and there may be an existential angst involved in this. So it's a subtext, I think, that might suffuse subsequent conversations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you want to?
Just to come back a little bit with a different tack on this infinity question, there is another word which I don't think has been mentioned yet, which is unity. Leibniz said a monad is a plurality within a unity. I've always thought this is an absolutely fascinating concept, and to try and give substance to it, it seems to me a lot of what Leibniz was struggling was to give expression to that. And I will say something about this tomorrow, but I wonder whether this doesn't relate to infinity and George's objection to it as something that, because you need something you can test. I think maybe that perhaps the mathematician is freer and can have concepts which don't require that final tying up together into a unity. And Ernst Machum, I'll be talking about tomorrow, also talks about the overwhelming unity of the all. I think this is also a very pregnant expression and is not unrelated to the question of how we think about infinity in science.
For Leibniz, it was infinite variety in the monad and the unified monad. So the notion of infinity was in there, certainly.
Mm. George, you want to get back on this, and then...
I want to make just two comments. I agree about the web of belief and so on. In fact, Lakatosh is the person who's developed that very nicely. But in fact, I think if you look seriously at any real physics claim where the word infinity is used in real physics, I think you'll find, in fact, it means a large number, not infinite. Like 10 to the 20 or something is used. In fact, there's a famous statement, take a number close to infinity like 2 and proves that. In numerical relativity, for instance, infinity is 200 or something like that. I think if you look at any real, genuine article, infinity actually means a large number, not actually infinite.
Mm-hmm. There's a gentleman at the back there. Yeah?
So this question's for Priya. It seemed in your opening statements that you thought that math had a certain type of role in explanation. And it was unclear, I think you said something that was very strong, which was that it was kind of ultimate arbiter of explanations. But I wonder if you'd want to back off of that a little bit, especially after something like Tim's point should be well taken. Explanations are for us, and there's a certain pragmatic role explanations play. So if I asked, why are you here? You could say, well, I came here with such and such speed, certain directions. Or you could say, well, I had an obligation and I had to come and fulfill my obligation. These seem like even non-competing explanations in a certain sense. So I was wondering if you're willing to countenance real, honest-to-God explanations that are non-mathematical but are, let's say, equally informative.
Well, I mean, I use the example of a mathematical explanation because it's a little freer of the empirical imperative than a physics explanation. And that was really the sense in which I was using it. I think that there is the point I really wanted to make is that one can reach agreement on the validity of a mathematical explanation. Yep, can respond. Yeah, sure.
Do you think that that's just true of mathematical explanations? So
that it is more often true of mathematical explanations than of any other form of explanations.
So
and there's a good reason for that, because of the system of the language of mathematics, which is self-contained, which enables those explanations to be formulated in terms of a proof, for example.
So a certain generalization in, say, psychology that says, in ambiguous situations, people look to other folks to see how to disambiguate the situation. And now you can make that very testable, and it's pretty widely accepted in different contexts, and you have well-run studies for it. It seems like there's actually no math referred to there, though, of course, mathematical concepts would be part of the testing. But I would think that you can get a same level of generality of acceptance, and likewise for an explanation of, why we're here in terms of intentions and beliefs. Do you think that the difference is something inherent in really having math in the explanation, or something wrong with the subject matter?
No, I think it is in how mathematics is used in formulating the explanation.
I think, yeah.
Bill Summers. In trying to think about how we're going to talk about this subject, I've only gotten to the first word, why. And I've been trying to think about how I as a scientist would answer or would talk about it, and how I would imagine a philosopher would talk about it, or a theologian would talk about it. And it seems to me, I only really understand how I as a scientist would talk about it. But it seems to me what we're talking about in answering the why is an explanation of how things came about. How did X come about? And the substrate, if you will, of the discourse will be stuff and laws and forces. On the other hand, the why question also seems to me to talk about, to require the substrate in other disciplines to talk about motivation and intention, as you said, which implies purpose. And I don't think the scientists usually talk about purpose or motivation. They want to talk about, as I say, stuff, forces, things that exist. Now, to what extent does motivation exist or purpose exist? It seems to me it exists in a different way than the stuff that scientists use as their substrate. And I think, I'm wondering whether we can even have a, maybe I'm sounding too much like those logical positivists of needing a meta language and Carnap and all that sort of stuff. But maybe we can't talk to each other because we have a different realm of discourse.
So if you go back to Aristotle, for him, we don't call it scientific explanation, but all natural explanations involve purpose, right? And so a purpose was everywhere, and that was completely natural for him. So how do we get to this point that you're in now, and that all of us are in, where there's scientific explanations completely separate from purpose, and that may be a division that seems very natural to us, but for most of the history of science, it wasn't a natural division at all. And I don't quite know how that came to be. It happened in the early modern period, where mechanistic explanation took over and purposes were sort of shunted away.
Yeah, this was part of the mechanistic philosophy of the 16th century. And
right.
I think if you want to read a text which exhibits most clearly that intellectual transition, just read the preface to Hobbes's Leviathan, the first paragraph of it, and it says all that one needs to know about, well, what is the difference between a world in which purposive questions are intrinsic to understanding anything at all, to a proscribing of those questions precisely in order to be scientific. I mean, the word scientific comes in as the rejection of that kind of explanation, and the polemic against Aristotle, which occupies those first few chapters of Hobbes's Leviathan, I think, written about 1642 to 1650, it tells you a great deal when you connect it up with what is actually going on within Descartes, Galileo, and so on in the same period. And it's very, very striking. And you ask the question, well, why do you have to define scientificity initially in negative terms, that is to say, of driving out purposive explanations in principle. You haven't got science until you've done that. You know, that's more or less what.
So in a way, isn't this conference really at the bottom, like, you know, Moore's "This is my hand, get over it"? Isn't it really about whether we believe in a purposeful universe or a universe without purpose?
I think it can't be reduced just to that question, but yeah, but I guess the P word and the C word make me very uncomfortable. Purpose and consciousness. So you may have noticed that I kind of avoided using either. Yeah, I think the question is, in what form can we think about purpose and agency in the context of our notions of kinds of explanations and what needs explanations, and as well as, I think, basically whether we think everything is knowable or not, or is there anything that's not knowable, essentially unknowable. It's just not a matter of time that, you know, technology will get us there, or whatever.
I want to come back to Leibniz again for a second, because Leibniz is one who believed he wanted to revive the appeal to purposes in science. So he wanted a full-blown science, and he saw that's completely compatible with purposiveness. So how that's possible is something that's well worth exploring.
I think just one quick comment. The idea that somehow or other introducing purpose is exceedingly dangerous thing to do, because you almost certainly will get theology if you do. It is, I think, something which I think is a bit of a myth. If you look at Thomas Aquinas' 5 arguments for the existence of God, the 5th appeals to purpose. The others don't. They don't even begin to appeal to purpose. They simply appeal to concepts like necessity and contingency in one case, or, you know, just simply the fact that things move and have causes in other cases, etc., etc. So I don't. I mean, whatever arguments there are for, you know, about, well, does scientificity eliminate purpose? Essentially, it seems to me not to necessarily raise any questions about, you know, theology and purpose and so on. But you've been waiting for ages to have a go at. I think it's your turn.
Well, first of all, to say I quite understand why Priya is avoiding the P word and the C word, and she's very wise to do that. But I do hope that she will, you know, drop that and at some stage, because to me, part of the interest of this meeting is that we are going to talk about the P word and the C word, and indeed the A word. That's anthropic and all sorts of other words.
I know.
We probably wouldn't talk about if we were
Absolutely.
just talking to scientists. But actually, the point I wanted to raise actually goes back, I'm afraid, to the last topic, and that's the relationship between physics and maths, which seems to me really crucial here. Now, we were having this discussion about infinity and whether that was a reasonable thing to talk about. George is not saying that infinity isn't of interest in mathematics or within philosophy. George is simply saying he doesn't think it's relevant to physics, into science. Yep. And I thought that was an important point to make. And that's why I said earlier, you know, there are things that might be meaningful in science, which are not meaningful from a scientific point of view, but are meaningful within a mathematical point of view. So there's no contradiction, as I can see.
No. Oh, yeah, I think
what Nick was saying about infinity being so important in maths and not being relevant to science. But the other point I want to make is that the question is physics just a small part of mathematics? You know, is there just a small part of mathematics which is relevant to physics and science, if you like, or is physics and mathematics actually the same? And in some interpretations of the multiverse, it's assumed that anything which is mathematical can correspond to something physical. So there's a big debate there. The whole question about string theory is that, of course, the greatest put down in some people's eyes is to say it's just mathematics. You know, it's nothing to do with physics. So the whole question of the relationship between maths and physics, to me, is absolutely crucial. Even before you get onto the question which was raised earlier of what happens when you go beyond mathematics.
Right. No, it's very well stated. Just want a quick clarification. I think that it's important to clarify that I think George is claiming that infinity is a placeholder in physics for just very large numbers, essentially.
I think we're probably going to have to draw this.
Let's
part.
continue a little bit.
Shall
Yeah,
we?
let's continue.
Okay. Right, okay, in the following order. I think, Evan, you have been waving for a good while, followed by you, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to, for a second, sort of piggyback. We left this idea of anxiety very quickly, but it struck me, Dennis, that you were sort of pressing us on the idea that this might be a silly question with silly answers, but I was also struck with the idea that it might be a dangerous question. And when Michael showed how close it was to the question, is there anything at all? I think that for a lot of thinkers, and maybe Wittgenstein is a good example here, moving from particular questions, how do I know something exists, to the generalized sort of skeptical worry, how do I know that anything exists, isn't, it might or might not be a silly question, but in some sense it's a dangerous question. And I wonder if we could raise a similar worry here about, is this maximally generalized question, does it raise worries that we don't have, epistemological answers to? Is it more of an ethical question in that sense?
Fair point.
Yeah. Maybe one needs distinctions between the response of anxiety and the response of contemplative wonder, if you see what I mean. If one compares, for example, the very beginning of Aristotle's Metaphysics, in which he says that, all philosophy begins in amazement. And I think Aristotle's answer, a continuing discussion, is not to say, well, what we do when we engage in scientific endeavor, as he understands it, is to reduce the levels of amazement. So that, what seemed amazing was now just obvious, though there's obviously, to some degree, that's precisely what you do. I mean, what the scientist does is to make obvious that which otherwise would be troublingly amazing. And I think one needs to distinguish between the anxiety which successful science resolves and the contemplative amazement from which science arises and which you are left with when you've resolved the anxieties. And I think that is quite an important distinction to make. Otherwise, I think one ships up in the existentialist position, with which I profoundly disagree, that you offer to say. Because somebody's got to disagree with somebody at this thing profoundly. Yeah? I hereby profoundly disagree with you. Yeah. Joel, you've been hanging on for a long time, so.
I think that one of the main reasons for this separation between the sorts of questions that science is comfortable with and the sorts of questions that are moved over to the theological realm of morality and that sort of thing, was the persecution of Galileo by the Catholic Church. This was an enormous shock. Galileo was the first widely known scientist, sort of scientific superstar. And there's little doubt that this had an enormous psychological impact on Descartes, who was preparing a discourse on cosmology, which he destroyed in response to the persecution of Galileo, and then to some extent resurrected 10 years later and published in the Netherlands. But I don't know that it had a direct impact in the Protestant countries, so I can't say that this was the cause of Hobbes' statement, published the year after Galileo died. But unquestionably, this was an enormous impact on Descartes and on all other scientists, I think, in the Catholic countries. And basically, what happened was that both science and religion agreed on this division, in each case for their own self-protection. And the question that I think arises today is whether this is still a good idea.
Could I very quickly say that while what you say is historically true about the 16th century, what you say, the same point can be made about the 19th and 20th century, except you have to denominationally reverse the terms. It's now a Protestant issue, fundamentally, that there is some conflict between science and religion, And Catholics are untroubled, for example, by the theory of evolution in a way in which it seems to me a certain kind of Protestant Christianity isn't. And I think one of the problems is simply this, that if you suppose that there's a single continuum occupied by theology on the one hand, or religion on the one hand, and science on the other hand, and the real question is how much of that continuum is occupied by what, then I think you find that religion has to get shoved off at the end, unless it does a very curious thing, and that is parade itself as alternative science. And that's what we've started to get from within the Protestant fundamentalist traditions in the 19th century, particularly in this country, where you've got a notion, to me, utterly curious, of something called creation science, which is about as oxymoronic an expression as I can imagine. And where does it derive from? It derives from the idea that somehow or other there's a single epistemological continuum, and that part of it occupied by science excludes religion from it, and vice versa.
So
I think getting past that, I think, is important to do, though how you get past it is a question to which I myself want this this conference to have some part in playing towards an answer, because just simply ships passing in the night doesn't do it for me.
Right. So Galileo was a subscriber to what was, at his time, a standard Catholic view of the two scriptures. That is the sacred scriptures and the book of nature, which Galileo also famously said was written in mathematics. But Galileo saw no contradiction between them, and this is very much in the tradition of Augustine, who wrote, among his lesser-known works, a book on how to read Genesis, in which he warned Christians not to make fools of themselves by taking Genesis literally. Yeah. So that's the problem with these fundamentalist Christians, that they want to take Genesis literally and other aspects of the scriptures, and that's a very dangerous thing to do, something the Catholic Church learned long ago. So on the other hand, even the Catholic Church has its problems with evolution. John Paul II said that the human soul must be excluded from evolution. Otherwise, there was no problem, he said. And I'm not sure scientists are very happy with that.
Right. Yeah.
Go back to infinity. The infinity and the testable. So, of course, the infinite is not directly observable. Precious little is. That's no reason for science not to think about it, and there could be good theoretical reasons for believing the universe is infinite, or believing in infinity in some form or another. So, an example that occurred to me is Newtonian physics. That makes best sense. Patrick, you can correct me here, I'm not even sure. It makes best sense if we assume the space is infinite. Or it makes best sense if we assume time is infinite. Otherwise, we have to, I don't even know how, perhaps people can tell me how it's to be done without that. But it would certainly look very, the most natural way to develop the view would be to assume the space and time are infinite. So there, that we have some kind of theoretical reason for thinking that's the structure of space-time. Of course, we've moved on from there. But we shouldn't close our eyes to the possibility there could be good theoretical reasons for thinking the universe and various things in the world.
Finger on this. That's okay. But I mean, I agree with that. But I also just want to make at least there's a perfectly well-defined notion of infinitude, and I think what Kit's referring to is what you'd naturally think of space going on forever being unmeasurably large, or time going on forever being unmeasurably long. There are other infinities, right? The assumption was that space was Euclidean, even if it was finite. In any finite region, there would be an infinite number of distinct points. That's a perfectly good assumption, right? If George thinks he knows a priori that space at a fine level has to be discrete by some methodological thing, I think that's just wrong. It's clear. This is clearly a perfectly clear mathematical possibility for the nature of space. It implies there are an infinite number of points in any small region, and it's something we have to look into, what the evidence can be for or against. It would be very strange to think we could a priori rule that out.
Do you want to get in right away?
Yeah, Pradeep Mutalik. I want to also raise the possibility that there might be an explanation, but that explanation may not be interesting at all. And let's go back to Einstein's question. Why is the universe intelligible? And why did a cognitive ape in the African savannah develop a mind that started understanding the world? And there's a very simple explanation, according to me, which is that when you have a bunch of facts, like for example, you see one animal going in a certain direction, when the sun is very hot, and you see a second animal, and you see a third animal, and so you see 100 animals going at around the same time when it's hot in a certain direction. And so these are 100 facts, and then suddenly it occurs to you, oh, there's a water hole there. And that's one fact. And when you take a bunch of facts and you have a deeper explanation, which is that explanation is cognitively simpler. And you can call this cognitive entropy. Whenever you have a bunch of facts that you synthesize into one single concept or a small bunch of concepts, we have an emotional reaction. We are satisfied. And so in a sense, Occam's razor is built into our brains. And it's also built, and that's why we find some explanations interesting, and they satisfy us. Now, and this works most of the time in the universe, which is why science is successful, because a lot of diverse phenomena very often have a common cause. And so when we intellectually simplify our model conceptually, it also is the answer in the real universe. But we know that there are some things that are not like that. They have explanations that are not simpler than the phenomenon itself. For example, in mathematics, there's the four-color theorem. And people looked for simple explanations, but there were none. And finally, it was solved by computer by considering every possible case. And that so the theorem is proved, but nobody can really comprehend it in detail because it's just a listing of all possible cases. So there's absolutely no explanatory value in that explanation or in that proof. And maybe there are some questions that are like that. There are answers, but those answers are not really, they might be intelligible to us in some way, but they're not really satisfying. And this might be one of those questions.
It is now 12 o'clock, which is the
Very
end
nice
of our
point.
session. And so far so good, I would have thought this promises well. In the old Soviet Union, the General Secretary of the Communist Party used to make a 4-hour speech, at the end of which everybody applauded, including himself. Right? Well, I think I ought to thank all three of the people who spoke here for having kicked off this discussion, and thank you for having taken it up so effectively and creatively. It's lunchtime, I think, now, isn't it?
I think so.
And we meet again at 1:30 back here. So thank you very much.
For introducing the speakers.
Yeah, so I have everything. Do you want to?